Great. Well, I've got my Matthew up. I think I just want to do a whole Bible study on. I think I just need to research all of Matthew one day and put this Sermon on the Mount within that context, because
As part of it, yeah.
I'd love to do that. It's probably my next one. I've done Mark and I've done Acts. I think it's time to do.
Was it because of the political nature of Mark that you chose Mark first?
It was because of Ched Myers.
Right.
So his.
Have you met him?
Never, no. I don't think I have. I met a guy once who might have been him, but I don't remember meeting. But I really liked that, and I thought, oh, I need to teach this. If I'm going to learn it, I need to teach it to other people, and that's what started that. But since then, I've become interested in doing the similar readings. I wonder what, like Scott McKnight. I wonder if he's written a whole Matthew commentary, for example.
I'm sure. Oh, good point.
I'd look at his.
I was just about to say I'm sure he has, but maybe I'm not aware of that. Okay, here we go.
I've done John. So if I've done John, I've done Acts, and I've done Mark, and I've done the Sermon on the Mount. So if I could do all of Matthew, then the next one would be Luke. Good.
Great.
I've lit my candle, which smells nice. I've got. What are you drinking?
So I have every so often there's a deal on these kind of boxes of random craft beers.
Oh, good.
And then I forget to cancel the subscription, so I end up with paying through the nose. So this is a fruitage.
Ooh, Belgian cherry beer, or is it
It's quite
cherry?
nice. It's very very strawberry.
The only time I've ever been like kind of properly drunk was when my friend and I drank too much cherry beer too quickly, and because it goes down so smooth, we didn't realize how much we drunk.
Well, that's the trouble with anything that tastes like
it tastes like a children's drink.
Soda. Right. And then you just think, oh, this is fine. And then you
Creek.
Then you
it's called Creek.
Stand up and you're like, ooh.
It was amazing. I rolled up the hill that night. That was fun.
So we're looking at oaths today.
Yeah.
So I've got it here as verse 33 through to 42. No, we're not doing turn the other cheek. 33 to 37.
Great. Yeah, it's good.
So we'll give it a bit of time. Our normal WhatsApp broadcast isn't working at the moment, so that's the normal rallying cry that we send out to people. So we're relying on people like Sean, who.
Why isn't it working?
The phone's died, and so when the phone dies, the WhatsApp dies.
Oh, I see.
So.
Well, so we're not going to have anybody writing in questions.
We might.
I hope so.
There might be some. Yeah. I preached on this one. Hey, it was good to see you last week.
Yeah, that was fun. We're alive, aren't we? So we
are. We are live.
Well, we didn't say anything or do anything that couldn't be recorded, so that's fine.
It's fun. Well, it's great walk. I missed the train by 2 minutes, so I sat at the station for half an hour. But that's fine. That's okay. I went to Tesco's and got a meal deal.
I don't really mind missing trains. I feel like it's just a bit of downtime,
right? And it's not like you can go anywhere, right? So
it's like you don't feel guilty. It's like you can't do anything except rest and sit and look at your phone or whatever. And it's nice. Yeah. Back in the days when I used to travel by train to things, I haven't traveled on a train in over a year.
Yeah, it's weird.
Very weird. You all right otherwise?
Doing all right.
I mean, I guess we don't have news because we hardly anything's happened since we last saw each other.
I know. What's going on? Not much.
Finished. I finished a writing project today, so that feels good.
Ah, nice.
I mean, I haven't edited it yet, but I finished it, and it's like 10,000 words, and I did it, and I'm like, all right, that's fun. I'm gonna have So I gave myself a treat, and I watched Loki.
Oh no! Loki, on Disney Plus.
Yeah, that was.
What's it like?
I like it. I think it's fun. Yeah, I think it's great.
There's a few series that have just come out with new. I'm quite into dystopias.
Yeah, same here.
And so I've been watching The Handmaid's Tale. I binge watched that last summer.
That's it's brutal. I just don't. It's too emotionally
too
intense.
Dark. Yeah. But they've just released season 4 of The Handmaid's Tale, or releasing series 4 episode.
Do they? And they completely break out of Gilead, don't they? I mean, there's scenes set elsewhere, right?
Oh, I mean, it's really interesting from a kind of liberal and, because obviously Gilead, its roots are actually in a reaction against liberal America, and
right.
So it's just, I mean, awful. I quite like, in a kind of bleak way, I quite like those really immersive worlds.
Yeah.
Where you're like everything. I mean, there's another one on Amazon called Man in the High Castle.
Yeah, I've read the book.
Oh, so the series is so good.
Yeah, I bet.
But I mean,
it does look good. Yeah, that does look good.
It's an intense.
Do you like the zombie stuff? Do you ever like the end of the world zombie?
No, I don't. I'm never into zombies. I just like Walking Dead and all that kind of stuff.
I'm more interested in the. I don't care about the zombie part. I'm more interested in the stories of how they try and rebuild society and what happens to society.
Yeah. That I can appeal. That appeals.
Yeah.
But Man in the High Castle, as you know, it's the premise of what would happen if the Nazis had won.
Yeah, like Japan and Germany own America, is that right?
Yeah, and that like the Rockies is no man's land.
Okay.
So it's the whole thing. I mean, it's so immersive that you've got the Empire State Building covered in the swastika.
Oh, no way.
And you're just like, it just kind of does like just the chills is that kind of reality. So, but I quite like those kind of otherworldly. The other series on Disney Plus at the moment is War of the Worlds.
Well, you told me about that, and I've been watching that now because it's good.
Oh, you enjoy that?
Yeah, I'm about 3 in or 2 in.
Yeah,
they've just discovered the weird dog robot thing. That's I'm up to that. But yeah, it's slow but good. I like that.
Yeah. And the dog robot is like just there's no music. It's just the silence.
Brilliant. It's so good. Yeah, it's really well done. I really like that. Yeah. Thanks for the tip. And there's some good stuff like Gabriel Byrne being like this kind of creepy ex-husband who all of a sudden now is sort of finding himself back with his wife, and it's great. Really clever.
Yeah, they got that's the second series of that is just coming out as well.
Oh, good.
So I think they've just Disney bought out series 1 whenever it was quite recently.
Okay.
And I think in anticipation that they knew series 2 was coming out. So it's kind of almost a kind of deliberate back-to-back.
Well,
right.
That's my next treat for myself.
There you go. Exactly right. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dig Deeper. It's great to be with you today. Welcome if you're listening live. Welcome if you're joining us on Zoom, and welcome if you're catching up on the podcast. It's great to have you with us as we are now well into our second series of Dig Deeper. Something that began as an idea between Dr. Stephen Backhouse and I over a year ago, and here we are still going.
Has it been over a year? That's amazing.
When I first reached out to you, Stephen, it was over a year ago, and then we kind of we began in the September. So although we've not been going a year, we started talking about it in the May, I believe, of last.
How many episodes have we done now?
I think we must be in total somewhere in the region of coming up to 30, I think.
That's great.
Yeah.
30 of these. That's so
good. I'll have to, for the next episode, I'll look up exactly how many, because there was something like 24, 25, and now we're in episode 4. So maybe it's not as many as 30. But
oh, good. And I finally got onto a microphone after it's taken 30 episods for me to get onto a mic.
We're gradually improving the tech. So hopefully the audio will be better than my kind of tinny laptop mic, and because I've got a mic as well, but not quite as fancy as you. You've got a pop shield going on there.
Well, yeah, this is all for the podcast, so I've gone into that.
So we are here, series 2, looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and we're talking, aren't we, actually, Stephen, about this potentially being part of the podcast that you also have another podcast on the side, which we've not referred to for a while.
Right. Yeah. So I run this thing called Tent Theology, that's over 50. That's been more than a year. So I think 57 episodes now or something, once a week. And I also have like a Patreon account. So various people support the podcast as well, and I release material for them as well. But I did think, what if we took this, especially this Sermon on the Mount that we're doing? I think this would be fun to release the recordings of this on the podcast, maybe twice a month, just to see how it goes. I often alternate between teaching and then I interviewed different people. Okay. And I think this would be a fun alternate. So having Sermon on the Mount discussion alternating with interviews with various people, some of them people you might have heard of, and other people just interesting people that I've met and think would be fun to give a platform to.
So if you want to find out more about that podcast, you'll be hearing maybe some of the things you've already heard, but you'll be hearing other things as well. And you can find out on 10th Theology, right? You just put that into the podcast.
Yeah, wherever you buy podcasts, wherever you purchase your podcast.
Yeah. Right.
It's on all those platforms. Yeah.
Advertising spiel over. We are going to be looking at truth telling, oaths, and the like, and quite differently actually from series 1, where we took quite large chunks of scripture. Sermon on the Mount only covers 3 to 4 chapters, and so we're going in, I guess, a bit more detail than we might do otherwise, with longer chapters like we did with Mark. So here we are. We're going to take a short passage. If you've got your Bibles with you, or if you're tuning in, then we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5 and beginning at verse 33 and to verse 37. So quite short, 5 verses or whatever it is.
Yeah, let's see what happens when we talk about this.
Absolutely right. So I'm going to read from N.T. Wright, if that's all right. Mm-hmm. It's all right with Wright. Here we are. Again, Jesus is speaking. You heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall give to the Lord what you promised under oath. But I say to you, don't swear at all. Don't swear by heaven, it's God's throne. Don't swear by the earth, it's God's footstool. Don't swear by Jerusalem, it's the city of the great king. Don't swear by your head, you can't make one hair of it turn white or black. When you're talking, say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. Anything more than that comes from the evil one. There we go.
Great. I also wonder, I've just now realized that I'd like to, I think the book of James talks about this.
Yes.
Did you know that? Did you pick that up?
I did know it. It was one of those editorial things when I preached on it on Sunday, that, I decided to not mention it, not because I didn't think it was important, but because in the editing process, it's the bit I hate the most, is editing sermons, because you want to say it all.
Yeah. Where would that be? Anyway, he does talk
James
about
5.
It. Okay.
James 5 talks about it.
Okay. James has like a sort of a commentary. Like James incorporates a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, or you can tell that the James is reflecting on it and using it into. If Sermon on the Mount is the Jesus teaching, then James is trying to put it into practice inside a church.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is good. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
So James is worth looking at. So how did you preach on this? What did you say when you had to preach on this?
Well, I talked about truth telling, because on one level, he starts off using obviously the practice of oaths, and what that means for, the law courts, and when you swear an oath, this, that, and the other. But actually, obviously, what he then boils down to is actually it needs to be your whole life. When you let your yes be yes and your no be no. And so I talked about truth telling, about the importance of telling the truth.
Right.
But then I talked about on one level that's very simple. The telling the truth is important. We would all value telling the truth. No one here would say, "Oh no, truth telling isn't." We want to be around but liars, and but actually, the nuance of the challenge of that, though, in certain circumstances, because sometimes truth telling isn't always the most helpful or even the most ethical thing. Right. I got a little bit into a kind of the nuances of truth telling when it's not so clear cut. And Scott McKnight talks about it really well in his commentary. And
Okay.
I mean, he poses the question, and we'll get there in a moment, because I think the truth-telling thing, why is truth-telling important, I think is really fundamental to understand the why, not just the instruction. But Scott McKnight kind of poses the question: if you're well, we just talked about The Man in the High Castle just earlier, watching TV shows, but if you are, you know, in the early 1940s, and you're hiding Anne Frank in your loft, and there's a knock at the door, you know, from the authorities, and they say, are you hiding anybody? You know, the truth telling would be, yes, I am.
What does he think you should do about that? He thinks it's okay to lie.
Well, he then cites Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
So, but I think we'll get onto that in a moment, because I want to kind of talk about what I think the principles are behind truth-telling, why it's important. Because I think for me, the reason I said that truth-telling is important is because I think it's the essence of what it feels to me that Jesus is doing throughout these kind of mini case studies. Is you know, what I've kind of set up in our Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus has these case studies of how to live out this idea that he is the fulfillment and completion of the law.
Yeah, right.
This is what I'm not come to abolish it, but I have come to fulfill it, and this is what it looks like. And we talked before about Scott McKnight talks about the whole idea of the Jesus Creed, and you know, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that, if you like, is the mandate, and then the Sermon on the Mount is this is how you live it out.
Right. Yeah.
And so in this case, what I find interesting is that actually in each of these cases, Jesus, what seems to be drawing out is that by being angry towards somebody, or to commit adultery in our heart or with our eyes, as it were, and in this case, the third case study is, you know, let your yes be yes, to lie is something. There's something about it breaks our humanity with other people. These aren't rules just to abide by for our own sake, but actually it's something about the humanity of one another. That
like
if
a contract you're having with somebody. Yeah.
And if I lie to you, Stephen, or even if I kind of allow you to believe something that isn't true, even I talked about the nuances of like what Jesus is talking about here is honesty, but there's huge range of avoiding honesty. It goes from outright lies all the way through to just allowing you to believe something that's not true, and me happy to kind of step back. You know, there's ways in which I can do that.
Yeah.
And if any of those things on the spectrum, if I outright lie to your face, if I give you a half truth or a mistruth, or even just allow you to believe something that isn't true, there's something about that breaks a connection between you and I. That our humanity and what it is to be in relationship with one another in the created order is about connectedness.
So this is like that same element we've been watching where Jesus makes where people are tempted to, or they're kind of addicted to the idea of thinking of themselves as following like checklists, like they're checking off certain lists. He always makes it much more individual or personal. So he's not individualistic, but he is personal. He says, no, it's about you and how you are thinking and treating another person. It's not about how kind of the bare minimum you can get away with.
Yeah.
So it's not a rule-based or a law-based way of thinking where you kind of say, well, I've checked that box, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Or that doesn't apply to me, so I'm fine. He kind of says, no, what if it did apply to you? Like, what if the you shall not murder applied to every single human being, whether they've physically murdered somebody or not? What would that look like? You know, what? And I guess that there's something here. You're right. He's personalizing it, making it to be about you and how you carry yourself.
Yeah. Because to be angry with somebody or to look at somebody lustfully is to objectify and is to distance yourself from them. And it's the same with telling the truth.
So you're talking a lot about the truth telling here, but you're not talking about swearing oaths, which I think we should talk about here.
Well, that is the beginning.
Because he doesn't say you shall not lie. He says you shall not swear oaths, which you're right. Truth telling is a huge part of it. But, you know, it's the oath part that begins this passage, right?
Yeah. And I think the reason I guess what I use that as a standing point to then leap into the truth telling stuff, because because the oath, as far as I understood it, the oaths were about presenting ourselves before God. You know, when we swear an oath, whether in the law court or indeed in my case, I've sworn an oath to my bishop. That is essentially, it's like I'm placing myself in the presence of God in doing so. So calling upon the name of God.
Yeah.
And say, I swear before God that I'm telling the truth.
Well, I don't think you should have done that. I actually, I don't think that the oaths that you swore to the Queen and the bishop, to be perfectly frank, I think those are the oaths that Jesus is talking about here.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of oaths.
Yeah.
When Americans pledge allegiance to the flag. Yeah. That's one of the oaths. When somebody stands in court and they put their hand on a Bible, for example.
Yeah.
That's one of those are all examples of things that Christians do now all the time, thinking that that's part of their Christian duty. And that is the sort of thing Jesus said, don't do.
Yeah.
And so I want to look at that. I do think this is really interestingly, this is like a major, it's overlooked a lot, but it's actually kind of a major point in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
It's a major, it's a real rupture between how humans are supposed to carry themselves, how followers of Jesus are meant to carry themselves in public.
Yeah. So we'll go back to the oath in a minute, but where I took it was, if swearing an oath, wherever you do that, in the law court or indeed in the church, as it was in my case, is essentially presenting yourself before God as if to say that only now will I be honest because I've suddenly said this oath.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, well, hang on a minute, surely you understand that God is everywhere. God is your witness, whether in private or in public, whether in the law court or in the market square.
Yeah.
You know, so that's why I came to say, actually, it's about honesty with our whole life.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. And it's like these oaths are being used as a proxy or a substitute for us actually being honest. So it's like, well, I made the oath and I went through the motions and I did this publicly. And rather than actually being a faithful person, you just go through the motions of checking the boxes of being a faithful person, right?
Yeah.
And that's where Jesus is drawing this line. But
so you wouldn't swear if you Stephen Backhouse is put into the witness dock.
No.
And you wouldn't swear on the Bible then?
No. My grandfather, apparently, I don't know how true this is, but apparently my grandfather he was a psychiatric nurse. And so he had a lot of violent patients. He was the kind of nurse that had to like manhandle violent patients and put them, back. Yeah. Right. And so because of his job, I think he had to appear in court every once in a while because sometimes his patients did things.
Yeah.
And because of this verse, he and things like this, he refused to swear on the Bible and stuff. And it's really interesting because it was one of those times where the judge eventually was like, oh, well, you are a trustworthy person, so I'm going to accept you in this court, right? And it was one of those times where it's kind of like, my grandfather didn't decide I'm going to have nothing to do with the court. What he did is he said, I am fully happy to participate in this process, but I will not swear on the Bible. What do you think? Do you still want me? Right? So do you see what happened? Like he gave the court the decision whether they were going to use him or not. He didn't decide
whether his testimony was valid or not.
Yeah. And I do find this is a really interesting position. I think he's very right to do that because that seems to be the kinds of thing Jesus is talking about here, where he's like, it's not a position of judgment. I'm not telling you to like tell the whole world to just go to hell. I'm saying participate in the world, but do it in your own terms. And if they accept you, then they've accepted you. And if they don't accept you, well, then you're not good enough for them. Like they don't want what you're offering, right?
You tell me this is, in many ways, it feels completely uncontroversial to say, let your yes be yes, your no be no, and tell the truth in all circumstances. And some of those circumstances might be in a law court, in which case, tell the truth again, just as you would do in the market square, just as you would do in private, just as you would do with your family and your friends, tell the truth. So how have we come about to a position where 2,000 years after this has been spoken, we're still, in fact, Christian tradition has led us to the point of swearing oaths.
Yeah, I know. Because I know I'm a broken record, but it is kind of to do with a sort of patriotism, nationalism that I was talking about, which is why when I talked about the Pledge of Allegiance, but it also is the same thing. Like you had to swear an oath to the Queen to become a vicar, for example, in the Church of England. And those are the kinds of oaths that Jesus is talking about here. They're the kinds of public declarations you make to prove yourself to be a good, upstanding citizen, right? So he's not talking about the kind of oaths that people are taking. They're not like, it's not like if I said to you, I just saw a dog with yellow spots. I swear to you by heaven that I'm telling the truth, right? It's not like that. It's more these kind of the sorts of declarations you make to grease the wheels of society, to keep yourself a good, upstanding member. These are the kind of oaths he's talking about, including marketplace type oaths, like the kind of ones to do with business transactions, the ones to do with oaths of allegiance or loyalty to various institutions. Those are the kind of things he's talking about here. And what you had was this culture of, well, in the Hebrew culture, I mean, the Jews knew that you're not supposed to take the Lord's name in vain, right?
Yeah.
So what you'd have is an elaborate, sort of almost like concentric circles of the more important the oath was you had to take, the closer you would get to God without actually saying God, right? Which is why you get this like, well, I swear by Jerusalem, the holy city, or I swear by the heavens, or and that, or you could swear by your own life. So the idea is that the Lord is in charge of your life. So when you swear by your own life, you're also sort of flirting with talking about the divinity there, right?
Yeah.
And
these are all substitute terms.
They're all substitutes for God, but they're all also sort of attempts to like publicly demonstrate how committed you are to the thing that you are pledging allegiance.
Right. So which means if you're like only swearing by your own life versus the heavens, and you're like, I'm not so sure I believe this guy as much as if he'd said by the heavens.
And one of the problems with this is that people were, rather than actually being good neighbors, they were going through an elaborate show of being a good neighbor and swearing about it and skirting as close as they could to the name of God without actually saying it. So Jesus comes along and he's like, rather than going through this elaborate pantomime, what you're actually doing, what you actually are is a lying blasphemer. Because because Jerusalem is actually, you can't get away from God. Jerusalem is God's footstool. The heavens is God's throne. Your head belongs to God. All these things that you're doing, you're actually just blaspheming anyway. You're taking God's name in vain anyway. All because you are not a trustworthy person, right? So stop being a lying blasphemer and start just being honest in yourself. Start just being trustworthy in yourself.
Yeah.
And don't go through these displays of outward allegiance, right? And I do genuinely, honestly think that these pledges and these oaths that we all have to take, they are binding us to idolatrous. They are idolatry. That's what's happening. We're being bound to human institutions which are claiming from us more than they should. They are claiming a level of allegiance and identity which they should not. Yeah. I mean, that's why this is why I'm not an Anglican vicar. My church wanted me to administer the communion, to help administer communion.
Oh yeah.
And to do that, I had to go. I had to sign an oath that I was going to pledge an oath to the Church of England. And I like my church. It's absolutely fine. Like, peace be on them. I'm not going to sign an oath to them. You know.
So it's so interesting.
I don't want to do that.
So interesting how these things have just become woven into the tapestry of tradition, or
and they are all about citizenship, right? Like all these things we're talking about, they are all about sort of demonstrating your allegiance to this tradition or this institution. And this is why, with my political theology hat on, I see this as a really deeply political thing, which, by the way, like, do you know about the Anabaptists?
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, forget about the Anabaptists. Even earlier on than that was the earliest Christians. They wouldn't do the oaths that were required of them for allegiance to Caesar, for example, because they recognized how political, like, the oaths that they didn't do were the political oaths. Those were the ones they weren't doing based on this kind of stuff. So they really got it right away that this was the connection here. It had to do with binding yourself to a nation or an empire, or that's what they were refusing to do. But interestingly, they weren't then turning around and waging some kind of violent rebellion against Rome, right? So they weren't like burn it all down and raise up arms and fight it. They were just, well, we're not going to fight you. We're just not going to pledge allegiance to you. What do you want to do with us? Over to you. What are you going to do about it? Right?
Yeah.
And throughout history, some nations and empires have lived with that when they find Christians who do that. But by and large, the Christians get persecuted. The ones who try and not pledge those oaths, they get persecuted.
Right.
Usually in the history of Christianity, they're being persecuted by other Christians, by the way, because Rome became Christianized pretty early on. And so to pledge allegiance to Rome was now to pledge allegiance to some sort of Christianized version of Rome. And ever since then, it's been the Christians who have had power, and they wield it against other Christians who refuse to pledge allegiance to their power structures. Yeah.
So in a moment, we're going to talk about what we talked about near the beginning, which is around the nuance of truth telling. You know, if fundamentally you don't swear oaths because you need to live a life of honesty. And so how do you do that in some pretty complicated situations, like the situation that Scott McKnight kind of alludes to?
Yeah.
But before that, we got a question that's come in, and I think it's really helpful and pertinent. We are straying now into kind of more political theology. So,
well, if you didn't want that, you shouldn't have got me here.
Well, lucky for us, we have a political theologian in the room, and it's not me. So, do you not think that at some point as Christians, this is the question that's come in, at some point as Christians followed the call of Christ to make disciples of all nations, it was inevitable that nations would therefore be converted, that leaders of nations would become Christians, a la Constantine, I'm guessing, and that we would end up in a situation where we have a national church, or certainly Christians in powerful positions. I've added that bit on.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how inevitable it is. All right, let's break this down. Let's attack the question. I can see who wrote it, so I'm you know I like you. You know I'm not attacking you personally. But let's attack the question a bit, right? Like, they make disciples of all nations. So making a disciple of a nation, when you go and look at Matthew 28, what you're doing is you're calling people out of their nations into yours. You're not converting the nation. You're bringing people out of it. So when you make disciples of a nation, you are drawing them out of their home culture or their inherited traditions, and you're drawing them into the new kingdom, which, by the way, this is what the Sermon on the Mount is, right? It's the manifesto for the new people of God, which is why oath telling keeping is so important to Jesus, because he's like, don't keep binding yourself to other kingdoms. Don't keep binding yourself.
That nation imagery, would you say? I'm not going to try and.
So the nation is not a bordered. There wasn't passports and border control. The nation was an ethnic.
Is that why
heritage.
We get Paul giving this kind of idea that we are the new Israel? Is that where that?
Yeah, exactly. So the early Christians are thinking of themselves as a new people group.
Yeah.
And it's not geographically located, by the way.
Right.
So we got to stop thinking of nations. Nations and states are not the same thing.
It's not ethnically divided either, because they.
No. So the early church was made up of multiple ethnicities who were now calling themselves one nation. And they were geographically located all across the land. So they weren't thinking, we only want to have one type of ethnicity in one type of geographical state. That's not what they were thinking, which is the logic of a lot of nationalism and nation state stuff. So when they talked about making disciples of all nations, they mean like, go out and preach to the Gentiles and the Jews and the Persians, right? And the Chinese and the Spanish and the Indians and whoever it is that we know about, go and preach to them and make disciples out of those people.
And call them into
the new nation. You're a new people, a royal priesthood, right? So it's overtly political because it's all about offering an alternative. It's all about not having allegiance to the groups you were born into. But it's not about dominate the nation and run it. They're not trying to run a nation. And the Sermon on the Mount is not a rule of life for the world. It's a rule of life for the people of God, not for everybody. It's for people who call themselves followers of Jesus. So historically, we can see this absolutely happening, that as people who call themselves Christians became in charge of their countries, the Sermon on the Mount stops being paid attention to. It falls by the wayside. They either stop talking about it completely, because you can't run a country according to the Sermon on the Mount, or they privatize it. And they say that it's for personal, it's just for private consumption. But as soon as you have any public positions of power, you don't need to follow the Sermon on the Mount anymore. But of course, the irony is that all the lessons Jesus gives, all the examples you talked about, they're all public, including this one. This is about your public life.
Yeah.
Turn the other cheek and going the extra mile, which we're going to look at later. That's about a public response to a public act of violence. So all of these things are public. Jesus is talking about them he's assuming that the followers are going to be acting in public, that they're part of their wider community. And he's saying, act according to a different rule. So would it be inevitable that these nations would be converted? Well, no nation has ever been converted. That's a lie. That's an absolute lie. There's no such thing as a Christian nation. There's lots of nations that have been shaped by a Christianized form of law, but a nation cannot profess that Jesus is Lord.
So even if you're to park that, the bit of the question that I'm interested in is what happens then when leaders, when it says it would be inevitable that leaders would become Christians.
Yeah.
So the example that is most obvious, but may not be as, it depends on what you mean by conversion, would be Constantine.
I know. Yeah.
And so the question really is then, what happens then if you're in a place of political leadership? Is it that you then you are then, you talked about, you form a new nation. Is it that, for example, at the point of Constantine's conversion, that actually what he should have done was kind of leave his position as emperor of Rome?
Can I just point out that Constantine understood this problem better than we do now, because he did not get converted. Do you know that he chose not to be baptized? He left baptism until his deathbed. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
And through his entire political career, he kept the pagan symbols and the Christian symbols both going on his iconography. He printed coins that had pagan symbols and Christian symbols. He basically was hedging his bets, or he was backing two different horses. And he deliberately did not take baptism until his deathbed, because he knew that if he was going to become baptized, he wasn't allowed to kill his enemies. And guess what? You can't be the emperor of Rome if you're going to kill your enemies. So he actually understood more than we do now that there are some jobs you can't do and be a follower of Jesus.
Which raises the obvious question: can you be president of America?
You can't be in charge. You can't deliberately try and seek the death of any human being and be a follower of the way of Jesus. For example, which does mean there's a lot of jobs out there in this world that are really hard to do. Now, this is where you tell the difference between being a Christian. See, this is the question kept asking about being a Christian. I'm like, well, you can be a Christian and be all sorts of things, obviously. You cannot be a follower of the way of Jesus.
Okay.
And do all sorts of things. And there is a difference. So we're not talking about Christian history here.
And you're not, I know, would you talk even about salvation here? Are you saying there's a...
No, I'm not talking about... the Lord is merciful and kind, and the Lord will save whoever the Lord wants to save. That's not up to me. I'm not talking about whether you're going to see somebody in heaven or not. I'm just saying, like, when somebody who's dropping atomic bombs on their enemies or picking up handguns to blow their enemies away, when they finally show up, and they do it all in calling themselves good Christians, and they show up at the pearly gates, and Jesus is going to say, well, welcome to heaven. Did you follow my way? And they're going to have to honestly say, no, I didn't. Did you put all your energy that you could into finding ways to love your enemies rather than kill them? Did you did you find ways to not cleave to the institutions and the patriotism around you, but to show your worth to your neighbors in other ways? No, I didn't do that. Right? Did you live a life that was geared towards the acquisition of money? Oh, yeah, I did. Well, welcome to heaven, but you didn't follow my way. I'm not talking about salvation here. I'm just talking about the way of Jesus. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount isn't a list of things you do to get to heaven when you die.
No.
It's a list. It's a description of what it is to be a follower of the way of Jesus, what his people look like.
Yeah. And it's not about the rules. That's the whole point about Jesus. It's actually it's about the heart.
It's not rules. It's like, are you the kind of person that went through life not having to constantly show outward displays of your own patriotism or allegiance to your institutions, Yeah. And then if you can't honestly say yes, then I think Jesus can ask you, well, why not? What kind of person were you? Yeah. Why did you feel the need to keep cleaving to these different institutions? Which, by the way, every single one of them, there isn't a single country on earth that is not founded on genocide, rape, murder, acquisition of land. Like, I'm today. It's Canada Day today, and so I'm not celebrating it, but like it's Canada Day, and then all these patriotic Canadians. Like, there isn't a single scrap of land that hasn't been taken from another person in Canada, right? Any white person is living on land. And I realized this today, and I went and had a look at. There's a website. It's really cool. There's a website you can find. I forget what it's called. Native-land, native-land. It's called. And you just type in your postcode or your town that you grew up in, and it will tell you which native groups used to own that land or be in charge of it.
Wow.
And I have discovered that I grew up on Blackfoot territory. I just discovered that, and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do with that. I didn't steal that land myself personally, but I grew up on land that was stolen. And I just did. And that's part of my truth. I'm a beneficiary of stolen land.
Yeah.
And right now, Canada is going through huge. I'm getting a bit teary. You got to look at what happened to. This is fun. I didn't know I was going to get teary. Yeah, go and look at what happened to residential schools that the church used to run for the government, and all these native children killed or died and then put into mass graves. And, it's just genocide. Like, this is why Christianity, why would you pledge allegiance to a church? Why would you pledge allegiance to a country built on the genocide of children? Just go and research it. This is what's happening. They're just discovering it now. 715 unmarked graves were discovered in British Columbia, and another 200 something in Saskatchewan. And that is what every country does. And that's Canada, which everybody is the most boring, kind, nice nation in the world. It's built on the blood of murdered children. And there's not a single nation, there's not a single flag that you could look at that doesn't have a similar story. Right? Why are you pledging allegiance to that thing? This is why there's no such thing as a Christian nation. There are people who are trying to follow Jesus in the midst of these things. But when you add the Christian label on top of it, all you're doing is telling a lie. You're just telling a lie. These are not Christian institutions. So this is partly where this theologian Stanley Hauerwas is very good. Because he talks about, he says, the most important thing is just tell the truth. Don't live a lie. All these patriots who think that there's a Christian nation, they're just perpetuating just this a lie that's stinking to heaven. And he's like, just tell the truth. And it's part of this. This is what I mean. It's like the truth telling is connected actually to the patriotism. It's like when you are sentimentally trumpeting your own country, you are participating in a lie. So just tell the truth. And that doesn't mean like I said, I can't personally do anything to the Blackfoot tribe, but I can at least acknowledge that I'm part of that world, right? Like, part of being a Christian is just acknowledging that we all participate, that we are beneficiaries of bad things, and not to then baptize that and pretend like it was just this wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Which is what Christian patriotism tries to do. It tries to take the idea that, oh, we're a Christian nation, so we should celebrate the triumph of Christian civilization. It's like, no, these are not good. This wasn't a good thing. So yeah, that's where I think being honest, it also just means sometimes admitting that we don't know what to do now, that we're not triumphant victors, that we actually have lost power, and maybe that's a good thing. I often feel this about a lot of Christians who get very, kind of fearful and angry about the idea that they've lost control and it's not a Christian nation anymore. And I'm like, the world has seen what happens when Christians get their fingers on the buttons of power, and it hasn't been good.
Yeah.
So maybe Christians not being in power anymore isn't the worst thing that's ever happened. It's certainly been utterly corrosive to Christianity. So
Stephen, that's so helpful and moving to think about it in those terms, because I didn't go there on Sunday when I preached about this, but this
right.
Kind of swearing of oaths and what that does for us in terms of swearing allegiance to anything other than Jesus.
Yeah.
Because actually what Jesus is saying, and we saw this all the way through Mark's gospel, is abandon, leave behind all the places of power, the places that give you so-called identity and agency over other people, and come and follow me. Essentially, that was the call all the way through Mark.
Yeah.
Challenging the power structures, saying, "Come and follow me," and we see it here. And I hadn't made that kind of very clear sense in which we with our life. Okay, I can't remember the last time really that I swore an oath of any meaningful kind, other than, like I said, in front of Bishop. But it's not a regular occurrence for me. But actually, there's a day-to-day patriotic swearing of allegiance with my choices, with the way that I think, with my right to what it means to be British or whatever it might be, kind of is in
this is one of those times when like charismatics are quite useful. When charismatics use language of have you ever heard of like the binding, like don't bind yourself, and binding and loosing, and charismatics love that stuff. And that's a really useful way of thinking about it. It's like every time you do that, like even every time you wear a shirt with a logo on it, I'm not saying all logos are bad or all football teams are bad. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying like,
that's good because it's the Euros this weekend. So
well, exactly. You are binding yourself to something. You are putting out a little tendril, and that tendril is hooking itself onto something else, and you are associating yourself with another larger institution, right?
And it's interesting what that does to you.
Shaping your identity. Yeah, I was just going to say it shapes you as well.
Yeah.
So it's like, be careful who you bind yourself to.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm a Tottenham fan, and it's pretty bad times at the moment. And honestly, it changes my mood when we've lost, or it changes. Now I know that at a surface level, you're like, well, that's just because you're just passionate about the game or whatever. But actually, there is something in there about some kind of, I take a pride when we're doing well. There's something in there about my sense of my ego has been boosted because they're doing well. I mean, it's just maybe I'm kind of getting into it too much. But there is that, you're right, there is that sense of attachment and all that does to you as you process these things.
Well, and you can see where like, we'll let your yes be yes and your no be no. In a way, it's just think of it as like, become more self-contained. Like, don't rely on other things to do the work, the heavy lifting for you, kind of thing.
And habitually live out this truth-telling.
Truth-telling
isn't reserved for the special moments in life.
No.
Truth-telling is...
It's just be a truthful person. So this is what Jesus is saying. It's like, don't tell the truth, be a truthful person. Don't perform truth, just be it,
And I think going back to that kind of sense of self as well, is that I explore, one of the things I explored on Sunday was one of the reasons that we struggle to tell the truth fundamentally is about self-preservation. And and again, I kind of borrowed from my favorite book recommendation from Dig Deeper, which is The Slavery of Death. And the idea that actually truth-telling, if that's about human connection, if I'm truth-telling in a real way with somebody else, I'm not hiding myself, I'm not fearful of another person, that shows that I am unguarded, undefended, and I'm able to connect with you or whoever I'm speaking to at a genuine heart-to-heart level that is not hidden or broken in any way, because I'm not worried about my own self-preservation. I'm not thinking about that.
Wow. See, I never thought of it this way, but you're absolutely right. I haven't thought about it that way before, but it's going to tie in really well with the stuff that's going to come up about resolving conflict or clutching tightly to your own rights.
Yeah.
About when somebody sues you or that kind of stuff, which we're going to come up with in a second.
Think about the times when you and I might be tempted to, lie, maybe more overtly or even more subtly allow someone to believe something that isn't true. The reason we do that is we're worried about what people will think of us.
It's a self-preservation. Yeah.
Or even we kind of lie, or we kind of, again, omit certain truths because we are fearful of, well, not fearful, we're trying to gain something. Again, usually it's somebody else's advantage, all again rooted in that self-preservation thing. Like the reason that we are not truthful is because we're fearful. And the reason that we're fearful fundamentally is a fear of death. And that kind of what we want to.
Wow. See, if I was a charismatic, I'd be going, whoa, man, that's good, man.
I'll take that.
And you're absolutely right, because it's going to show up when Jesus says, do not worry. I tell you, don't worry. Look at the grass. They're clothed even better than you will. Look at the birds. Yeah, it's that. Think how much happens in this world socially and politically because we fear our own. We're just preserving our own life at the expense of others, basically. But kind of a fear of death, which, of course, in the book of Hebrews, Jesus, they recognize that the cross releases us from the fear of death. Not death, because you're going to die, John, but you are released from the fear of death.
Yes.
Which is the thing that causes so much problems, right? And that's what it works itself out politically and socially in our institutions, that we build these things to protect us. I know we've only got a few minutes left, but
I want to go on to the nuance, but I don't know what you want to go. The nuance of when truth telling actually becomes quite tricky. But
let's talk about that in a second. But can I just finish with verse 37?
Yeah,
because this is all part of my. So Jesus says, rather let your yes be yes and your no be no, because anything else comes from the evil one, right?
Yeah.
And the word there is sometimes translated as the evil one or the ones who belong to the evil, like evil people.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of a deliberately obscure word, because sometimes in the New Testament, it from context clues, it looks like it's referring to Satan, and other times it looks like it's referring to humans, right? So the word itself is sort of deliberately vague, and I think it's poneros. I can't remember the exact word, but the idea here. Remember, I've talked about how Satan is a political demon, right? Do you remember I've talked about that? Like, you got to pay attention whenever Satan shows up. It's always about power.
Yeah,
that's what he does. He's the Lord of the nations. He's the Lord of the rule. He's the ruler of the spirit of the air. He's the one who offers Jesus the nations.
Yeah,
he's the one who had the power and then was set up by God to sort of rule the nations, and then got proud and wanted to rule even God, and then was sent down. Right? Like, that's the story of the Satan. And here Jesus brings him in when he's talking about oaths. It's political. It's about power. He's like, don't be like the people who are following the way of Satan. Don't bind yourself to these things. So that's all I wanted to point out. That wherever you see Satan, there's always something to do with power and allegiance and even nations. They always shows up within one or two verses on either side of Satan. There's always something to do with politics.
And he's also, of course, the father of lies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And these are the lies. This is why, like the Stanley Harris I was saying, like, he's just like, one of the main things you have to tell followers of Jesus is just tell the truth. Just live honest lives, because anything else is from the father of lies. Yeah. So yeah, truth telling. Now we want to talk about the nuances of
nuance, because like I said, Scott McKnight raises this question and says, you're hiding Anne Frank in your loft. You're trying to save her life, and there's a knock at the door, and the authorities say, "What are you hiding anybody in your?"
Yeah, right.
Now,
what would you do?
Well, it's interesting because I preached on this, and then someone mentioned that in Corrie ten Boom. I haven't read the book, not for a long time anyway.
Yeah.
I've read bits of the book in the past, but in Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch Christian who hid Jews in her attic, and apparently there's either a story told, I don't think it was the Ten Boom family, of one family that felt so convicted by this verse that they were convicted that whatever the knock at the door was, they would tell the truth.
Right.
They were still hiding Jews in the attic.
Yeah.
But if that knock at the door came, and if they said, "Are you, do you have anyone here?" they would say, "Yes, we are," and would essentially hand themselves over and trust God for that. Now, so this is where the ethical debate comes in about, when does truth telling, because truth telling is all well and good, but there are a lot of times when actually it's not as simple as that, and particularly where the context is really different. So what I said is that truth telling is contextual. That's not to say it's, you can be fast and loose with when you tell the truth, but depending on the context, depends on the appropriateness of the truth telling. And what Scott McKnight talks about is, and what he appeals to basically Bonhoeffer, because Bonhoeffer, of course, was this conspirator. He conspired to kill Hitler. He was arrested and eventually executed for his conspiracies with others. And Bonhoeffer apparently wrote a paper, an essay called "What Does It Mean to Tell the Truth?" while he was in prison awaiting his death, essentially. And what he essentially says, and I think this is where I would land, I'm quite persuaded by this, is that truth telling is contextual, and that context is relationship. And in addition to that, truth telling is as much about being true to people and being true to God as it is about the words that you utter.
Yeah, right. Well, and probably so even more so. Yeah.
There's more to truth telling and being truthful than simply speaking truthful words.
Yeah.
And so if we are to be true to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, if we're to be true to that, sometimes that might mean being dishonest with our words.
Yeah.
To enable that. And he says, we're in a broken world and we're left with ethical choices which are not perfect. And so the examples I gave, for example, is that if somebody on the street asked me an intimate question about me and my wife, for example, the Christian answer, the truthful answer, as it were, would be to tell the truth. But the context of the relationship I have with that person,
you'd be betraying your wife for the sake of a stranger. I would not
be being true to her.
Well, I mean, imagine if your daughter brought you something that she made, like a piece of art or something, and she says, "Daddy, do you like it?" And the honest answer is, "I don't understand what it is. It's a piece of rubbish that you put a crayon on." But what you say is, "I love it," or "That's really clever of you," or something, right? I mean, that's not lying. You're preserving the spirit of a little person.
Right. And I think that, and so Bonhoeffer, interestingly, kind of says, this is how you decide what is appropriate in the truth telling. And he basically, I'll just go through them. There are three fundamental principal points he puts. He says, you can know when something should be, what you should say in any given truth telling situation by firstly recognizing who calls on me to speak and what authorizes me to speak. In other words, you're identifying, are they right to ask me?
Right. Yeah.
And am I right to be the one to talk?
Yeah.
It might be that someone says, "Oh, I've heard it said that so-and-so is having issues in their marriage." Now, you may have the truth, as it were, but you may not have the right to speak into that.
Yeah.
Because that may not be information that it's appropriate to share. And equally, it may not be appropriate for that person to ask. The second point he says is recognize the place in which I stand. So, do I stand there as the person who's married? Do I stand there as the friend? Do I stand, what is my role within this conversation? And the third thing he says is you put the subject about whom you speak into the center of that truth-telling experience.
Okay.
So the knock comes on the door.
Yeah.
Are you hiding Jewish people? And
Yeah.
to be truthful to God and to be truthful to the greater ethic of saving lives,
Yeah.
you say, no, I'm not, because you know that they have bad motives. You know the position that you have is one as a friend.
Yeah.
And you are preserving the life of those who are. So that's his way of kind of creating an ethic and a shape around truth telling. But
Well, why? Yeah. Okay. I like that, because it's like, I mean, what's happening is with this yes, yes, and no, no thing is Jesus is effectively asking you to become self-contained, right? To not be somebody who's just swayed by the mob sentiment or outward shows. And I can see this, what Bonhoeffer's talking about here, doing that as well. It's kind of like, no, you're a more moral agent. You have the right. You can choose. You can decide what's going on here. You have it. You're self-contained. You don't, just because some guy in a uniform asks you a question doesn't mean you have to give him exactly the answer that he wants.
Yeah.
You get to choose. They don't get to choose.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that, part of the challenge in my job is that for example, I'm privy to people's lives, and even just as employer, I'm privy to things that I am privy to. And if someone were to ask me out of the blue, well, what about this person? Actually, it's appropriate for me to say, I can't tell you that.
Yeah.
Because that's being, again, true to the people that I'm placing at the center of this conversation.
I mean, there's a difference between saying I'm not going to tell you and lying as well.
Yeah, that's true. And you can be boundary, but don't we feel awkward? Don't we feel awkward about that when we put a boundary in front of a person and say,
yeah, we do. Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you that. And people kind of feel, oh,
yeah,
God, you know.
It's kind of part of this idea of like, followers of Jesus will just be awkward grit in the wheels sometimes. I mean, they don't just automatically do whatever it is that society says you should do. And it doesn't mean that they are agitating to destroy society.
Yeah.
Which is partly why, you know, this idea of Christians in leadership, by the way, which is like, well, are you saying Christians shouldn't be in leadership? I'm like, well, I think more what I'm saying is followers of Jesus should give the world the chance to reject them rather than them rejecting the world. So if you want to get a position of power, you say, I will take this position of power, thank you very much, but I won't press a button that will kill a human being.
Yeah.
Do you still want me? That kind of thing, right? And all I'm saying is it makes your job a lot harder. There are being a follower of Jesus makes a lot of jobs a lot harder, but it doesn't automatically mean that the world is going to reject you. Sometimes you can give the option to them to receive you or not.
But it's usually a lot harder when you're in it.
Oh, of course it is.
It's in some ways, it's easier to set out your stall at the beginning and say,
yeah,
this is
all these Christians who think, oh, I'll just kind of hide my values, and then when I'm in a position of power, I'll reveal and I'll be a good influence. That never happens. You always get corrupted because you've had to compromise and corrupt so much by the time you even get to that position.
Yeah.
It's partly what happens I talk to Christians in politics all the time, and this kind of thing happens all the time.
Yeah.
And it's just worth thinking that you can be a person of influence without having to be in the official corridors of power as well. And that Christians on the margins just have to be cleverer. But by the way, if you find yourself on the margins, well, you just now found yourself with all the people Jesus wants you to be with anyway. So, I mean, to say, oh, if I act like a follower of Jesus, I'll just be on the margins of the corridors of power. It's like, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's wrap things up there for another evening, Stephen. Oh, what a great conversation.
Yeah. I wondered whether we were going to have enough to talk about, and look at that.
Yeah, that was 5 verses, and we
emotionally engaged.
We've gone well over, and I'm really grateful, really challenging stuff. And next week we'll be looking at very famous passage.
Yeah, right.
Turning the Other Cheek. And so we'll be looking at that next week. It won't be live next week. Stephen's taking a well-earned break, but we will be pre-recorded. And so do tune in, and we will broadcast it as live at 8 o'clock. So please join us then. Stephen, thank you for another fantastic week. It's been great chatting.
Oh, good. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye. Good.